The day the set went silent, the western town on the backlot had been designed to feel alive. False front buildings leaned into the sun with carefully painted cracks meant to suggest age. Dust was scattered across the packed earth to make it look like a frontier street that had seen 1,000 boots and 1,000 gunfights. Extras in cowboy hats laughed between takes. Crew members moved cables, adjusted lights, wiped sweat from their faces, counting the hours until the long weekend. It was supposed to be an easy day. One more stunt, one more sequence, and everyone could go home. Dean Martin stood near a cluster of lights, jacket slung over one shoulder, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. He was in his late 40s, already a legend, already carrying that effortless calm that cameras loved and crowds responded to. To most people on that set, he was the star, the name on the poster, the reason the movie existed at all. But to the crew, Dean was something else too, reliable, on time, polite. A man who learned names, who said thank you, who treated grips and electricians with the same casual respect he gave producers. He had been making movies long enough to know one unspoken truth. The faces on screen got the applause, but the people behind it carried the real risk. The stunt being prepared was not unusual. Second-story balcony, breakaway railing, a rope swing, a fall onto hay bales stacked below. It was the kind of thing Hollywood had been doing since silent pictures, the kind of thing that looked dangerous but was meant to be controlled, engineered, predictable. Dean had watched versions of it dozens of times over the years. He had fallen himself early in his career before studios decided stars were too valuable to risk. Now men like Bobby Castellano did it instead. Bobby wasn't famous. He wouldn't be interviewed on talk shows. His name wouldn't be printed in large type, but he was known where it mattered. Among directors who needed something done cleanly, among stunt coordinators who wanted someone fearless but not reckless, among crew members who watched him work and felt safer when he was the one stepping onto the edge. He had the body of a former athlete and the habits of a careful craftsman. He checked knots twice. He tested boards. He asked annoying questions about anchor points and load limits. Some people teased him for it. Others quietly respected him for it. That morning, while the makeup department powdered Dean's face and adjusted his hair, Bobby had been across the lot, tightening gloves, rolling his shoulders, running his hands along the rope that would soon hold his weight. He had already walked the path of the stunt twice. He had already looked at the beam where the rope was fastened. It looked right. It felt right. He trusted the crew. They had done this before. They had always done this before. Dean saw him briefly as he crossed the street set, heading toward the balcony. They nodded to each other. No words, just the kind of acknowledgement that passed between people who worked in the same dangerous neighborhood of illusion. Dean turned back to his mark, listening as the assistant director called out adjustments. The cameras were being positioned. A wind machine hummed somewhere. Someone cracked a joke about the weekend. Someone else laughed too loudly. Then the call came, quiet on the set. The western street stilled. The laughter stopped. The idle conversations faded. In that strange way only a film set has, dozens of people fell into a shared silence that felt artificial and tense at the same time. Dean shifted his weight, hands in his pockets, eyes drifting toward the balcony where Bobby now stood. The sun caught the dust in the air. The railing had been scored so it would break cleanly. The hay bales below looked thick and forgiving. Action! Bobby ran. His boots hit the wooden planks in a fast rhythm. He reached the railing, slammed into it with his shoulder exactly as rehearsed. The wood snapped outward exactly as designed. He grabbed the rope, swung into space. For a fraction of a second, it was perfect. Then the world changed. There was a sound that didn't belong, not the crack of staged wood, not the grunt of a planned impact. It was deeper, wrong, a hollow metallic tearing followed by a violent, empty snap. The beam jerked. The rope went slack. Dean saw Bobby's body shift in midair in a way no rehearsal had prepared for. Not a swing anymore. Not a controlled arc. Just a man suddenly weightless, arms reflexively tightening around something that was no longer there. Then gravity took him. He fell straight down. Not into the hay. Past it. The impact echoed across the soundstage with a brutality no sound engineer could ever recreate. It wasn't loud in the way explosions were loud. It was final. A blunt, sickening punctuation that shut down every other noise. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then someone screamed. Not an actor's scream, not a scripted one, a real one torn out of a real throat. Dean was already running. He didn't remember deciding to move. His body did it for him. He crossed the street set, boots kicking dust, pushing past stunned crew members who seemed frozen where they stood. He heard someone shouting for a medic, someone else yelling for an ambulance. He dropped to his knees beside the man on the ground. Bobby lay twisted in a way the human body should not be twisted, one leg bent at an angle that made Dean's stomach clench. Blood darkened the dirt beneath his head, spreading slowly, horribly. His chest rose and fell, but shallowly, like it was afraid to commit to the next breath. The set medic was already there, hands moving, voice sharp, telling people not to touch him, to give space to get the stretcher to call it in. Dean barely heard him. Bobby's eyes were open. They weren't focused, but they were open. They drifted, then stilled, then drifted again. Dean leaned closer, close enough to smell dust and blood and the faint chemical tang of the set's fake smoke. "Bobby," he said, his voice lower than he intended, as if loudness might break something even worse. "Help's coming, you hear me? Help's coming." Bobby's lips moved. No sound at first, just breath and a faint, wet sound that might have been a word trying to exist. Dean took his hand. The grip was weak, shockingly weak, but it was there. Bobby tried again. His mouth worked, jaw trembling, eyes flickering. Dean leaned closer. "Rose," Bobby whispered. The name came out thin, broken, but unmistakable. "Rose," he said again, as if forcing the world to remember her. Dean nodded, though he didn't know why. "I will," he said without thinking. "I will." Bobby's eyes searched his face, not for recognition, but for assurance, for something to hold on to. Dean squeezed his hand, feeling the life in it slipping like sand through fingers. "You're going to be okay," Dean said, though even as he said it, something inside him knew how empty it sounded. "Just stay with me, stay here." Bobby's eyes fluttered. His grip loosened. The medic checked his pupils, his pulse, then looked up and barked, "Where's that ambulance?" It felt like forever. In reality, it was minutes. Minutes in which Dean knelt in the dirt, unwilling to move, unwilling to let go of a hand that was growing colder, lighter. Minutes in which the western town, built to pretend at death for entertainment, stood as the setting for something it was never meant to hold. When the ambulance finally arrived, red lights spilling across fake storefronts and painted windows, Dean stood back as professionals took over. They slid Bobby onto a board, fitted a neck brace, started lines, spoke in clipped, urgent fragments. Dean watched every movement, every adjustment, trying to read meaning into faces that had been trained to hide it. They loaded Bobby in. The doors closed. The siren rose. And then the ambulance was gone, its sound trailing away across the lot until even that vanished, leaving a silence heavier than before. Dean stayed where he was for a moment, staring at the darkened patch of dirt where a man had just been broken. Someone touched his shoulder. It was Chuck Morrison, the stunt coordinator. His face was pale. His eyes were fixed not on Dean, but on the balcony above. "The beam," he said, almost to himself. "It pulled out of the wall." Dean followed his gaze. Crew members were already up there, staring at the dangling rope, at the exposed wood where something had ripped free. "It wasn't supposed to," Chuck said, his voice shook. "It was rated for this, it was supposed to hold." Dean's jaw tightened. "What happened?" Chuck swallowed. "I went up there, the anchor. There are supposed to be 8 bolts. That's what the safety specs call for on a load like that. 8. He paused. "There are 3. Dean turned to him slowly. 3. "Someone cut corners," Chuck said. "Someone decided 3 was enough." Enough? The word hung in the air, ugly and small. An assistant director approached, clipboard clutched to his chest as if it might protect him. "The studio's shutting down for the day," he said. "They want statements. They want everyone to." "What hospital?" Dean cut in. "Cedars-Sinai." Dean nodded once. "I'm going there." "Dean, you should probably." "I'm going to the hospital." There was no anger in his voice, no drama, just a statement of fact. He found Joey Bishop standing a little apart, shock written plainly across his face. "Joey," Dean said, "I need you to do something for me." Joey looked up. "Find his wife, Rose, tell her what happened. Tell her I'm going to meet her at Cedars." Joey nodded, swallowing. Yeah, I'll call." Dean didn't wait for anything else. He walked to his car, hands trembling now that there was nothing left to hold on to, and drove. The streets of Los Angeles looked wrong. Too normal. Too full of people buying groceries, laughing at corners, living in a world where a man hadn't just fallen 40 feet because 3 bolts had been cheaper than 8. He kept seeing it. The moment the rope went slack. The look in Bobby's eyes. The word rose. At Cedar's sign, he paced until a nurse directed him to the waiting area. He sat. He stood. He sat again. He didn't look at magazines. He didn't hear the television murmuring somewhere overhead. He stared at the doors that led to places he wasn't allowed. When Rose Castellano came through those doors, he knew her instantly, though he had never seen her before. She was small, dark-haired, moving too fast, eyes scanning every face, every sign, every hallway, looking for a shape that was no longer on the set. "Rose," Dean said, standing. She turned. "Where is he?" she asked immediately, the words tumbling over each other. "Where's Bobby? What happened? Joey said he fell, but he didn't. He couldn't." "He's in surgery," Dean said. "They took him in not long ago. They're working on him." Her face collapsed in a way Dean would never forget. Not a dramatic breakdown, not a scream, just a quiet folding inward like something that had been holding her upright had suddenly vanished. Her knees buckled. Dean stepped forward and caught her, guiding her to a chair, holding her steady while she shook. "He checked everything," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He always checks everything. He's careful. He's not reckless. He's not. This wasn't him." "It wasn't," Dean said firmly. "The equipment failed, not him." They waited. Hours that felt detached from time. Dean stayed. He didn't make calls. He didn't go back to the studio. He sat with Rose, fetched water she didn't drink, spoke to the neighbor watching her children, let her cry when she needed to, let her sit in silence when words were useless. When the surgeon finally came out, mask pulled down, eyes tired, Dean stood with her. The words were careful. Severe injuries, head trauma, broken back, massive internal damage, a coma, no promises. Rose cried in a way that wasn't loud but was complete, as if every part of her had become grief at once. Dean held her shoulder. Somewhere between the doctor's sentences, something inside him hardened, not against the world, not against fate, but against the idea that this would be allowed to become routine. Another incident report, another line in a ledger, another family told to be grateful for whatever number someone decided a life could be reduced to. At dawn, when Rose admitted she needed to call her job because she couldn't afford to lose it, Dean felt that hard place inside him sharpen. She needed to work for the insurance. The wife of a man who had just nearly died on a studio set needed to worry about her part-time job for benefits. Dean left the hospital that morning and drove back to the lot, not to film, not to give a statement, but to find the people who decided what a life was worth. He didn't yet know how far this road would go. He only knew he had heard a scream, seen a man fall, held his hand as he whispered his wife's name. And he knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with contracts or studios or releases, that whatever came next could not be handled the way Hollywood usually handled things. Because something had broken that day. Not just a beam. And Dean Martin was not going to let 3 bolts be enough. The price tag. The Universal lot looked different to Dean the next morning, as if the sunlight itself had shifted into something colder. The western town facade was still standing exactly as it had been, tidy and convincing from a distance, but now he could see the illusion for what it was. He could see the false boards, the painted cracks, the staged dust that had seemed harmless yesterday. It felt obscene that the set still existed at all, that a place built for pretend violence could swallow real blood and then go right back to waiting for the next action. Dean parked farther away than usual, walked with a steady pace that didn't match the storm inside him, and ignored the way people straightened when they noticed him. Crew members, assistants, even a couple of executives who suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Everyone had heard what happened. Everyone had a version of sympathy prepared, but sympathy was cheap in a town where everything had a budget line. He didn't go to wardrobe, didn't go to makeup, didn't step onto the set. He went straight to the production offices and asked, calmly and clearly, for whoever was responsible for handling the situation. The phrase itself made him want to spit. A man lay in an ICU bed, and it was being referred to as a situation, like a scheduling conflict, like a broken camera, like a leaking pipe that needed to be patched before it cost them time. The assistant at the front desk looked startled, then cautious, then deferential as she checked a list and told him a name. Lawrence Feldman, Business Affairs. It sounded like the kind of title that existed to make cruelty look clean. Feldman's office smelled like expensive tobacco and newer leather. The furniture wasn't made for comfort, it was made for authority. Feldman stood when Dean entered, smiling with the polished ease of a man who had spent his life smoothing unpleasant realities into paperwork. He extended his hand, and Dean looked at it without moving. The smile flickered slightly only for a second, but Dean saw it. Feldman's eyes slid to Dean's face, recalculating, deciding how to manage this conversation. "Mr. Martin," Feldman said with practiced warmth. "A terrible accident, truly, we're all very." "How's the stuntman?" Dean asked, voice even. Feldman's smile tightened. "Mr. Castellano is receiving excellent care from what I'm told. Our people filed the required incident reports. We've been in touch with the hospital, the studio's insurance." "I want to know what you're doing for his family," Dean interrupted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words landed like a door being shut. "He has a wife, 3 children. He might not wake up. If he wakes up, he might never walk again. What are you doing for them?" Feldman gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, as if seating Dean would somehow return control to him. Dean remained standing. Feldman's hand hovered awkwardly, then dropped. "We're handling everything according to standard procedure," he said, and there it was, standard procedure, Hollywood's favorite lullaby. "Mr. Castellano was hired through the stunt coordinator as an independent contractor. He has union coverage. Our liability is governed by the contractual release he signed acknowledging the inherent risks of stunt performance." Dean felt something in his chest go still, like a predator pausing before it strikes. "Your crew used 3 bolts instead of 8. Feldman's eyes narrowed a fraction. "We're investigating. If there was an error in the rigging, appropriate measures will be taken." "Appropriate measures?" Dean repeated, tasting the emptiness of it. "And what about appropriate help? Not measures, help, money, care, security. What does his wife get if he dies because your beam wasn't secured?" Feldman breathed in slowly, as if preparing to deliver a delicate truth that the rest of the world simply didn't understand. "I understand this is emotional," he said carefully, "but we do have to operate within legal realities. The studio's contractor injury policy covers immediate medical costs up to $50,000. That is standard. After that, the union policy takes over. In the event of a fatality, there is a death benefit." Dean's mouth went dry. "How much?" Feldman hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he knew exactly how ugly it sounded when said aloud. $10,000, he said finally. "Again, that is consistent with industry norms." For a moment, Dean didn't speak, not because he didn't have words, but because words felt too small for the violence of what he'd just heard. 10,000. An amount you could spend on a weekend in Vegas, an amount you could lose in a bad investment, an amount that meant nothing to the men in offices like this. $10,000 for a woman to raise 3 children alone. 10,000 for a husband's life. 10,000 for a body broken because someone decided 8 bolts was too many. Dean leaned forward slightly. "You just told me a man's life is worth less than the catering budget." Feldman's jaw tightened. "Mr. Martin, please, this is not about what anyone's life is worth. It's about what the policy provides." Dean stared at him. "Then your policy is an insult, and your standard procedure is a sickness." Feldman's voice cooled. "The studio cannot set a precedent. If we go beyond contractual limits in this case, we create liability exposure in every future incident." "So that's what this is," Dean said softly. "Exposure, not a man, not his children, exposure." Feldman spread his hands with a gesture meant to look regretful. "We're sympathetic. We truly are. But the reality is that stunt work is dangerous. Mr. Castellano accepted those risks when he chose his profession." Dean felt heat rise behind his eyes, not tears, but rage. "He accepted the risk of falling in a controlled stunt," he said, voice still steady but sharper now. "He did not accept the risk of negligence. He did not accept the risk that your crew would ignore safety specs. He trusted you to do your job, and you failed." Feldman's expression hardened, a mask slipping. "I'm not here to debate philosophy," he said. "I'm here to ensure the production continues and that the studio's legal obligations are met." Dean nodded slowly, as if he had just been handed a map of the enemy's territory. "Then get me legal," he said. "Now." Feldman didn't like being ordered, not even by Dean Martin, but he made the call. 15 minutes later, Dean sat in a conference room that felt like a courtroom without a judge. 3 lawyers, Feldman, the producer, all of them with folders, all of them with careful faces. The lead attorney, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, walked Dean through the studio's position the way someone might explain the weather, releases, contractor status, assumption of risk, caps, policies, standard. Standard. It was a language designed to turn a broken spine into a manageable expense. Dean listened, jaw clenched, and waited until she finished. Then he asked a question that made the room shift. Have you spoken to his wife? The lawyer blinked. Not directly. Business Affairs has been in touch. Have you looked her in the eyes and told her husband is worth $10,000 if he dies? Dean asked. Silence. The producer cleared his throat. Dean, we all feel terrible about what happened, he began, but you have to understand. No, Dean cut in. You have to understand. I watched him hit the ground. I held his hand while he tried to speak. He whispered his wife's name like it was the only thing keeping him alive, and you're sitting here talking like this is a damaged prop. The lawyer's tone remained composed, but a thread of irritation crept in. Mr. Martin, your emotions are understandable, but they are not relevant to the contractual framework. Dean's eyes snapped to her. My emotions are relevant because they belong to a human being, he said, and your framework is what allows this to happen again. The lawyer's face did not change, but her voice sharpened slightly. If you are asking whether the studio will exceed policy limits, the answer is that we may consider an extraordinary goodwill settlement to avoid protracted litigation and negative publicity. Dean leaned back slowly. A goodwill settlement, he repeated. Yes, she said. If Mrs. Castellano wishes to settle, the studio may be willing to offer a sum above the basic cap, provided she signs a full release. Dean's eyes narrowed. How much? The lawyer glanced at Feldman, who gave a slight nod. $75,000, she said. 75,000. It sounded larger than 10,000, larger than 50. It sounded generous to people who needed to sell generosity. But Dean did the math instantly, not as a businessman, but as a man who had watched hospital corridors swallow families whole. One ICU day could cost more than most people made in a year. Rehab could cost a fortune. Lifetime care, if Bobby lived but never walked again, if his brain never fully recovered, could devour that money like a match thrown into oil. Dean stood, pushing the chair back without drama. That's still an insult, he said quietly. It's a nicer-looking insult, but it's the same thing. Feldman's voice tightened. Mr. Martin, that is a substantial offer. It's far beyond what is required. Required, Dean repeated, and something in him twisted. You're right. It is beyond what is required by your paperwork, but it's nowhere near what is required by decency. He left the conference room before they could respond, walked out of the building, and stood in the parking lot with the hot California sun on his face. His hands trembled again, not from fear, but from the sheer pressure of wanting to do something violent to the system that had just tried to explain away a shattered man with numbers. Dean breathed slowly, forcing himself to calm down. Rage could burn bright, but it couldn't build anything. He needed clarity, and he needed a plan. He drove back to Cedars-Sinai. Rose was in the waiting room, eyes red, face drawn tight like she was holding herself together by sheer will. When she saw him, she stood too quickly, as if his presence might mean news. Did they say anything? She asked. About Bobby, about. Not about Bobby, Dean said, sitting beside her. About you. Rose frowned, confused. Dean didn't soften it. He believed in telling the truth cleanly without dressing it up. They have a policy cap, he said. They're willing to cover up to $50,000 in immediate medical expenses. After that, they expect union insurance to handle it. And if, he paused, watching her face, if he dies, their death benefit is $10,000. Rose's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then she let out a small, broken laugh that wasn't humor at all. 10,000, she whispered. That can't be real. It's real, Dean said. Rose's hands shook as she pressed them to her forehead, trying to hold in something too large. My house payment is Dean, her voice cracked. How do they say that with a straight face? Because they've practiced, Dean said, and there was bitterness in him now, old bitterness from seeing how people in power learned to make cruelty look like professionalism. Rose looked at him, eyes wet. They came by earlier, she said softly. 2 people from the studio, they brought flowers. Dean's spine went rigid. What did they say? They said they wanted to help, Rose whispered, ashamed as if she were confessing weakness. They hinted about a settlement. They didn't give a number yet. They said there would be paperwork. They said I shouldn't worry, that they'd handle everything. Dean's jaw tightened. He could see the trap forming, clean and polished. Flowers, sympathy. A number that sounded big to someone who had never seen big money. A clock ticking in the background. Pressure disguised as concern. Rose, Dean said, leaning closer so his voice stayed calm, so it stayed private, listen to me very carefully. Do not sign anything, not one paper, not one release, not one agreement, not until you have a lawyer who represents you. Rose swallowed. I can't afford a lawyer. Yes, you can, Dean said immediately without hesitation, because I'm going to pay for one. Rose stared at him like she hadn't heard right. Dean, no, I can't. This is my family, my problem. It became my problem when I watched it happen, Dean said, and his voice remained steady, but it carried something heavier now, a promise that had already been made in his mind. And it became my responsibility when the studio decided your husband is worth $10,000. I'm not letting them do that to you. Rose's tears spilled again, but this time they weren't only grief. They were fear breaking into relief and then into confusion. Why would you do that? She whispered. You barely knew Bobby. Dean's eyes moved toward the doors that led to the ICU, as if he could see through walls. Because he said your name, he answered. Because he tried to tell me something while he was bleeding on dirt that was supposed to be fake. Because if this can happen to him and they can treat you like this afterward, it can happen to anyone, and it will. Rose's voice trembled. What if we lose? What if they crush us? Dean exhaled slowly. Then they'll have to crush me too, he said, and they won't do that quietly. He sat with her for a long time, discussing practical things, her children who was watching them, what bills were due, what she needed from the hospital. He didn't make grand speeches. He didn't try to turn it into a heroic moment. He simply kept returning to the same point. She would not be alone, and she would not be bullied into accepting scraps while her husband lay broken behind a glass wall. That evening, Dean made a call from a hospital hallway phone to his own attorney, Samuel Cohen, a man who had spent years negotiating contracts, who knew every slick trick studios used when they wanted a problem to disappear. Dean didn't explain it in dramatic terms. He didn't need to. He gave facts: failed rigging, missing bolts, hospital injuries, insult offers. Cohen listened, then went quiet for a moment that told Dean he understood exactly what was at stake. This isn't just negligence, Cohen said finally. If what you're saying about the specs is true, it's gross negligence. Dean's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means the studio can't hide behind releases as easily, Cohen said. It means they're exposed. It means they're afraid. And if they're already floating settlement offers, they're trying to lock the widow into a number before she understands what the real cost will be. Dean looked down the hallway toward the ICU doors again. I want you to represent her, he said. Rose Castellano. Cohen didn't hesitate. I will, but Dean, this will turn ugly. They'll fight hard. Let them, Dean said. I'm done watching them call cruelty standard. When Dean returned to Rose, he told her simply that he had found her a lawyer and that everything would now go through him. Rose nodded with shaky relief, as if she had been holding her breath since yesterday and had finally been allowed to exhale. But even as she relaxed a little, Dean could feel the coming storm. He could feel it in the way nurses spoke in careful tones, in the way hospital administrators mentioned billing, in the way studio representatives would soon return with deadlines and smiles that didn't reach their eyes. He was right. 2 days later, the studio came back, not to the set, not to the office, but to the hospital, where the air was already heavy with fear. Feldman and the same lead attorney arrived in crisp suits that looked obscene under fluorescent lights. They carried a folder like it was a gift. They offered flowers again. They offered condolences again. They spoke with gentle voices, as if softness could hide the blade underneath. Mrs. Castellano, the attorney said, sliding the folder onto the table between them, we've prepared an offer that reflects how seriously the studio views this situation. $75,000. This is above standard policy coverage. It's designed to help your family immediately. Rose's eyes flicked to the number, and Dean saw the reflex in her, the desperate calculation of a mother trying to keep a roof over her children's heads. $75,000 was more money than she had ever had. It looked like survival. It looked like relief. But the attorney continued, voice still gentle. In exchange, you would agree not to pursue further legal action. This would resolve the matter fully and finally. Dean watched Rose's hands tighten on her purse strap. He watched her swallow. He watched fear and hope collide inside her face. Then Dean stepped forward, calm as stone. "She won't be signing anything," he said. Feldman's eyes snapped toward him. "Mr. Martin," he said, the warmth gone now, replaced by something sharper, "this is a private matter between the studio and Mrs. Castellano." Dean's voice remained quiet. "It stopped being private when your bolts were missing. It stopped being private when you offered $10,000 for a life. And it will stay very public if you keep trying to pressure a woman in a hospital waiting room." The attorney's smile tightened. "We're not pressuring, we're offering help." Dean looked at her and his gaze held no warmth. "Help doesn't come with a gag order," he said. "Help doesn't come with a ticking deadline. Help doesn't come with language that protects you and abandons her." Feldman leaned in slightly. "The offer expires in 72 hours, he said smoothly, eyes on Rose. "After that, we can't guarantee anything beyond basic coverage." Rose flinched. It was a threat dressed as policy. Dean placed a hand lightly on the folder and slid it back toward them. "Take it with you," he said. "Her lawyer will contact you." The attorney's eyes narrowed. Her lawyer. Dean nodded once, yes. Feldman's face hardened. For the first time, the mask fully dropped, revealing what had been underneath all along. Calculation, irritation, and a quiet anger at the fact that this situation was no longer following the script studios relied on. He stood abruptly. "Fine," he said. "But understand something, Mr. Martin. You are making this much more complicated than it needs to be." Dean held his gaze. "No," he replied. "You did that when you decided 3 bolts were enough." They left. Rose stared after them, shaking. "They're going to punish us," she whispered. "They're going to ruin us." Dean sat beside her, voice calm again, almost gentle. "They're going to try," he said. "And now they're going to find out what happens when someone stops being afraid." That night, Dean stayed late. He spoke to nurses quietly, asking what resources existed for families in crisis. He spoke to a billing coordinator and learned numbers that made his stomach tighten again. He listened to Rose talk about her children, Michael, Sarah, Tommy, how they kept asking when Daddy would come home, how she didn't know what to say, how she tried to sound hopeful even when hope felt like a lie. Dean didn't offer false comfort. He simply offered presence. And presence in that kind of place mattered more than poetic words. In the early hours of morning, when the hospital quieted and Rose finally fell asleep in a chair, Dean stepped into the hallway and stood alone, staring at the blank white walls. He thought of Bobby's eyes. He thought of that whisper. Rose. He thought of the studio's clean numbers, their smooth deadlines, their careful use of words like goodwill and standard. And in that silence, the decision inside him hardened into something permanent. This would not end with a check. This would not end with a private settlement that allowed the studio to repeat the same sins on the next set, with the next stuntman, with the next family too exhausted to fight. Dean Martin had spent years making entertainment, making people forget their troubles for an hour or two. But now he was staring at a different kind of work that couldn't be performed for applause, work that didn't come with a script, work that would cost him something real. He turned back toward the ICU doors. "Not like this," he whispered to himself. "Not anymore." And somewhere behind that door, a man lay unconscious because 3 bolts had been cheaper than 8. Dean didn't yet know how big the war would become. He only knew it had started. When silence became a weapon. The lawsuit was filed on a gray Monday morning that seemed designed to drain color from everything it touched. The courthouse steps were damp from an early mist, and reporters gathered in loose clusters, notebooks tucked under arms, cameras hanging idle but ready. Most days, legal filings happened quietly in offices and back rooms, but this one was different. Dean Martin's name was on the document, not as a defendant, not as a studio representative, but as the man financially backing a stuntman's widow in a negligence case against a major film studio. That detail alone made it impossible to ignore. Hollywood lived on image, and nothing unsettled it more than the possibility of an image it could not control. Samuel Cohen stood beside Rose Castellano as the paperwork was delivered. Rose wore a simple dark dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if she were bracing herself for wind. She had not slept. Dean could see it in the shadows under her eyes, in the way she held her shoulders too rigidly, like a person expecting to be struck. She did not look like someone preparing to make history. She looked like a mother who had left her children with a neighbor, so she could walk into a building that might decide whether their lives would collapse or survive. Dean stood a step behind her, not trying to take her place, not trying to speak for her. He was there so she would not have to walk in alone. He was there so the studio's lawyers would see that she was no longer an easy calculation. The filing itself was clean and unemotional, full of phrases like gross negligence, failure to adhere to safety specifications, and catastrophic injury resulting from preventable error. It alleged that the studio's rigging crew had ignored mandated safety standards, that the missing bolts constituted a reckless disregard for human life, and that the resulting injuries had permanently destroyed Bobby Castellano's ability to work, to walk, and possibly to live independently. The number attached to it, $5 million, was not chosen for shock. It was chosen because Cohen had done the math on lifetime care, on lost income, on rehabilitation, on the long horizon of a body that would never again function as it once had. By noon, the trade papers had the headline. By evening, it was on the radio. By the next morning, it was in every entertainment column worth reading. Dean Martin backs widow in lawsuit against studio. Some articles tried to paint it as celebrity drama, as if this were another feud, another personality clash. Others were sharper. They named the missing bolts. They described the fall. They mentioned the original settlement offer. And suddenly, Hollywood was being asked to look at something it preferred to keep in the shadows. The men whose bones and nerves made movie magic possible. Universal's response was swift and cold. Their attorneys filed motions to dismiss, arguing assumption of risk, arguing that Bobby had been an independent contractor who had signed a release acknowledging the danger of stunt work. They claimed there was no proof the studio itself had been negligent, that any fault lay with individual crew members or unforeseeable equipment failure. They attempted to narrow the case, to bury it under technicalities before a jury could ever hear the word bolt. Dean read every filing Cohen showed him. He didn't pretend to understand every legal maneuver, but he understood the intent. Delay, exhaustion, pressure. Studios had always relied on the same tactic: outspend, outlast, outwait. Families eventually ran out of money. They settled. The story disappeared. But this time the waiting game had changed. Rose's rent was being paid. Her groceries were being bought. Her hospital bills, those that insurance did not touch, were quietly covered. Dean did not make speeches about it. He simply made sure the fear that usually crushed families into submission did not have the chance to do its work. The studio's lawyers also began calling people, crew members, riggers, grips, anyone who had been near that balcony. Some were asked politely for statements. Others were reminded of contracts, of non-disclosure clauses, of the way Hollywood memory could be very short when someone became difficult. It was not open intimidation. It didn't have to be. In an industry where employment was never guaranteed, suggestion did the job of threat. Dean began hearing whispers almost immediately. A lighting tech pulled him aside near the commissary one afternoon, voice low, eyes darting. "They're nervous," he said. "Not about the lawsuit, about people talking. They're leaning on the rigging department hard, telling them to keep it simple. Equipment failure, nobody remembers anything specific." Dean nodded, thanked him, and drove back to Cedars-Sinai with the weight of that sentence pressing against his chest. Nobody remembers anything specific. It was how systems protected themselves, by dissolving responsibility into fog. Bobby remained in a coma. Days blurred into each other in the ICU. Machines breathed for him. Monitors spoke in constant electronic language. Rose sat beside his bed and read to him from old magazines, from letters the children had dictated, from a notebook where she wrote down things she wanted him to hear if he ever opened his eyes. Dean visited often, sometimes with words, sometimes with nothing but presence. He learned the rhythm of the ward, the shift changes. The nurses who spoke softly and the ones who spoke too loud. The doctors who tried to keep hope alive and the ones who believed in honesty even when it hurt. It was during one of these visits that Cohen pulled Dean aside in the hallway, legal folder tucked under his arm. "We need witnesses," he said quietly. "Real ones, not just accident reports, people who can testify to what they saw and what they know about the rigging." Dean leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "They're already leaning on people." Cohen nodded. "I know, and that's why it matters who's willing to stand up." That question was answered sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, a man named Louis Ortega called Cohen's office and asked to speak in confidence. Louis had been part of the rigging crew assigned to the Western Town set. He was not a supervisor. He was not someone whose name appeared on call sheets in bold. He was a father of two who had worked studio jobs for over a decade, grateful for steady pay and careful not to make trouble. He told Cohen he had not been able to sleep since the accident. He told him he kept seeing the beam pull away from the wall, kept hearing that sound. He told him there were supposed to be 8 bolts. "They were in the truck," Lewis said over the phone, voice rough. "I saw them, we had them." "Then why weren't they used?" Cohen asked. There was a pause long enough to hear Lewis breathing. "Because the foreman said 3 would hold," he said finally. "He said we were behind schedule. He said the beam wasn't going to take a full drop, just a swing. He said it was overkill, and nobody wanted to argue, not on a big picture, not when overtime was already an issue." Cohen closed his eyes briefly. Did anyone object? Lewis hesitated. "I said something," he admitted. "I said it felt light. He told me to stop worrying. He said the stunt guys were always exaggerating, always wanting more padding, more rigging. He said the studio had done this 100 times. And after the accident..." Lewis's voice hardened. "After the accident, they told us not to talk. They said all statements would go through legal. They said the beam must have been defective. They said nobody was to speculate about installation. They didn't threaten me," he added quickly. "They didn't have to." Cohen arranged to meet him that afternoon. Dean insisted on coming. They sat in a small office that smelled of old paper and coffee. Lewis looked like a man carrying a physical weight he could not put down. He kept rubbing his hands together, glancing at the door. "If I testify," he said, "I might never work again." Dean met his eyes. "If you don't," he said quietly, "this will happen again." Lewis swallowed. "I know, that's why I called." Cohen explained the process. Depositions, sworn testimony. The studio's lawyers would try to tear him apart. They would look for inconsistencies. They would imply incompetence. They would suggest he was lying to save himself. They would remind him in 100 careful ways of everything he stood to lose. "I don't want money," Lewis said. "I don't want to be famous. I just don't want to watch another guy fall because we were in a hurry." Dean reached into his jacket and placed a card on the table. "That's my number," he said. "If anyone tries to scare you out of this, you call me." Lewis stared at it. "What are you going to do?" Dean's voice was calm. "I'm going to make noise." The first deposition happened a week later. It was held in a bland conference room with a long, polished table that reflected light too cleanly. Universal's lawyers arrived in tailored suits, boxes of documents stacked neatly before them. Lewis sat at one end of the table, hands folded, a microphone angled toward him. Cohen sat beside him. Dean sat behind them, silent, deliberately visible. The studio's attorneys began gently asking about Lewis's background, his experience, his training. Then they moved inch by inch toward the beam, the bolts, the foreman's instructions. Lewis answered carefully, truthfully. Yes, the specifications called for 8. Yes, only 3 were used. Yes, he had raised concern. Yes, he had been told to proceed. When the attorney suggested that perhaps Lewis was mistaken, that perhaps he was confusing this job with another, Lewis shook his head. "I remember," he said. "Because I checked the crate. I remember because I thought about it afterward. I remember because a man fell." The attorney's tone cooled. He suggested that Lewis might be trying to deflect blame from himself. He suggested that perhaps the beam had been defective, that perhaps the bolts had sheared. Lewis shook his head again. "They pulled out," he said, "because there weren't enough of them." The deposition lasted hours. When it ended, Lewis looked exhausted, but something in him had shifted, as if speaking aloud had transferred some of the weight he'd been carrying. That night, the first call came. Not to Lewis, to Dean. A studio executive he barely knew invited him to dinner. Dean declined. Another called, suggesting they talk this out quietly. Dean declined. A third hinted that the lawsuit was unnecessary, that the studio was prepared to be more generous if the public aspects of the case were softened. Dean declined again. When Cohen relayed these overtures, he shook his head. "They're worried," he said. "Not just about the money, about the precedent, about discovery, about what else comes out if this goes to trial." "And it will," Dean said, "unless they do something real." "What's real?" Cohen asked. Dean thought of Rose in the ICU, of Bobby's body still unmoving, of Lewis's hands shaking as he spoke. "Change," he said. "Not a bigger check, change." 2 months after the fall, Bobby woke up. It did not happen the way movies like to show it. There was no sudden gasp, no dramatic opening of the eyes. It was a slow, uncertain return. A nurse noticed movement, a flicker, a sound. Doctors gathered. Rose was called in from the waiting room. Dean arrived before she did, summoned by a hurried phone call from the ward. Bobby's eyes were open when they entered. They were unfocused, drifting, but they were open. His breathing was labored. Tubes still traced lines across his body. When Rose spoke his name, his gaze shifted slightly, as if the word had weight. She took his hand and cried into it, telling him she was there, telling him he wasn't alone, telling him the children loved him. Bobby's lips moved. No words formed, but sound came broken and weak. Dean stood back, giving them space, watching a woman reunite with a man who had not yet fully come back. Over the next days, the truth emerged in pieces. Bobby's spine had been crushed. He could not feel his legs. Tests confirmed what the doctors had feared. The paralysis was permanent. He had also suffered brain injury. His memory came and went. Words sometimes failed him. The man who had once thrown himself through windows and off rooftops now struggled to lift a cup of water without shaking. When the doctors explained the prognosis, Rose wept in a way that carried not just grief but mourning for a life that had ended even as another continued. Dean was there when Bobby finally became lucid enough to understand. "This isn't a bad dream," Bobby said slowly, voice thick. "Is it?" "No," Rose whispered. Bobby closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. "Can't feel my legs," he said. "Can't remember half of yesterday." Dean stepped closer. "You're alive," he said, "and that matters." Bobby looked at him, really looked. "They came," he said after a moment. "From the studio while I was out. Rose told me they offered her money." Dean nodded. "They did." Bobby's jaw tightened. "How much?" "Not enough," Dean said. Bobby closed his eyes again and a tear slid into his hairline. "I gave them 12 years, he whispered. 12 years of falling, burning, crashing. I broke bones for them. I made their stars look brave. And when their mistake destroys me, they try to buy it off." "They don't get to," Dean said. Bobby opened his eyes, meeting Dean's. "Why are you doing this?" Dean didn't answer immediately. He thought of the courtroom that waited, of the articles, of the phone calls, of the system already pushing back. "Because this doesn't end with you," he said finally. "Because if it does, it happens again, to someone else, to another family." Bobby swallowed. "They'll come after you." "They already are," Dean said. "They just haven't said it out loud." Bobby studied him, then nodded faintly. "Then don't stop," he said. "Whatever it costs, don't stop." The studio's tactics escalated after Bobby woke. Suddenly, articles appeared suggesting the accident had been unavoidable. That stunt work was inherently dangerous. That injuries were tragic but part of the profession. An anonymous source questioned whether the rigging crew had really deviated from specs or whether faulty materials were to blame. Another hinted that Bobby himself might have misjudged the swing. Dean read every one of them. And then he did something the studio did not expect. He spoke. Not in a press conference, not in a carefully managed interview. He spoke to the people who actually mattered. He visited other sets. He spoke quietly to stunt performers between takes. He listened to their stories, the broken wrists, the burned skin, the falls that had almost gone wrong, the settlements that had come with silence attached. He told them about Bobby, about the bolts, about the offers, about the lawsuit. He did not ask them to testify. He asked them to pay attention. And they did. Whispers became conversations. Conversations became anger. Anger became something more dangerous to institutions than lawsuits, collective memory. By the time the court set a trial date, this was no longer just Rose Castellano versus a studio. It was the first crack in a wall that had stood unchallenged for decades. Dean felt it in the way stunt coordinators looked at him now, not with casual respect, but with something closer to gratitude. He felt it in the way studio representatives stopped calling and started sending lawyers instead. He felt it in the way Rose stood a little straighter when she walked into the ICU, as if the fear that had once bent her had been forced to share space with resolve. The silence that had always protected Hollywood's machinery had been broken. And once broken, it could not simply be repaired. The war Dean had stepped into was no longer about one fall. It was about whether the people who built Hollywood's illusions would continue to do so on the understanding that, if they were destroyed in the process, a number on a piece of paper would be expected to make their families disappear. That question was now headed for a courtroom, and Dean Martin was walking with it. The verdict that wouldn't stay buried. By the time the trial finally opened, nearly 9 months had passed since the fall. Seasons had changed outside the courthouse. Posters on Hollywood Boulevard had been replaced. New films had come and gone. On the surface, the industry had moved forward the way it always did, chasing the next opening weekend, the next headline, the next distraction. But beneath that constant motion, something was tightening. Word had spread, not just about the lawsuit, but about what it represented. Crew members followed updates in break rooms. Stunt performers whispered about it on sets. Lawyers who had built careers protecting studios were suddenly forced to defend them in a way that could no longer rely on quiet settlements and forgotten names. The courtroom itself was larger than most civil courtrooms, chosen to accommodate press and public interest. Wooden benches gleamed under high lights. A low murmur filled the air before proceedings began, a mixture of journalists comparing notes and spectators craning for a view of the man whose name had drawn them there. Dean Martin sat quietly near the front beside Rose Castellano. Rose wore black, not for show, for Bobby, for the life she had lost even though her husband still breathed. Bobby himself was not present. His doctors had advised against the strain. Instead, he remained in a rehabilitation hospital, learning how to move his arms with more control, learning how to speak around the fog that still settled over parts of his mind. On the table in front of the jury would be photographs of him before and after the fall. The contrast would be his testimony. Samuel Cohen rose to deliver the opening statement. He did not begin with law. He began with a morning, with a breakfast of pancakes, with a father kissing his children goodbye, with a man walking onto a set expecting to come home. He described the beam, the missing bolts, the sound of a body hitting dirt. He described the hours in surgery, the coma, the paralysis, the man who could no longer feel his own legs. Then he turned to the jury and said something that made the room shift. He said that danger was not on trial. Stunt work was dangerous. Everyone in the room knew that. What was on trial was the decision to ignore safety standards in order to save time and money. What was on trial was whether a corporation could reduce a human being to a liability number and walk away. Universal's attorneys stood next. They were composed. They spoke of risk, of contracts, of the long history of stunt performers accepting danger as part of their calling. They emphasized Bobby's experience, his knowledge of the profession, the release he had signed. They spoke of equipment failure as something tragic but unforeseeable. They avoided the word bolts in the opening minutes as if not naming them might make them less real. The first witnesses were technical. Engineers, medical professionals, accident reconstruction experts. They showed diagrams of the balcony, charts of force distribution, x-rays of Bobby's spine, scans of his brain. They spoke of load tolerances and compression fractures and permanent nerve damage. They described a body that would never be the same. A body that would never support the life it once carried. Jurors shifted in their seats. Some stopped taking notes and simply stared. Then Cohen called Luis Ortega. Luis walked to the stand slowly, shoulders tight. He raised his hand and swore to tell the truth. When he sat, he glanced once toward the back of the courtroom where a cluster of studio executives sat together, faces carefully neutral. Dean watched him from his seat, hands folded, eyes steady. Cohen asked him about his work, his years in rigging, his training. Then he asked him about that morning. Luis spoke clearly. He said the specifications called for 8 bolts. He said only 3 were used. He said he had raised concern. He said he had been told to proceed. He said there were more bolts in the truck. He said time and budget had been cited. He said he had been instructed after the accident to let legal handle everything. Universal's lawyers tried to break him. They suggested confusion. They suggested faulty memory. They suggested he was blaming others to protect himself. Luis answered steadily. "I know what I saw," he said, "and I know what wasn't there." When the cross-examination ended, the courtroom felt different. The abstraction had vanished. The case was no longer about contracts. It was about a choice, a human choice. Someone had looked at a specification and decided not to follow it. Someone had decided that what should have been done did not need to be done. Someone had decided that if something went wrong, it would be handled later. The next witness was Chuck Morrison, the stunt coordinator. He testified about the safety protocols, about the meetings, about the checks, about the assumption that the rigging crew had done what they were supposed to do. He spoke of the moment he saw the beam pull free. He spoke of looking up and realizing there were not enough bolts. His voice shook when he said, "It should not have failed." Doctors followed, neurologists, orthopedic surgeons. They spoke of Bobby's spinal cord injury, of the irreversibility, of the brain trauma that would likely never fully resolve. They spoke of lifelong care, of secondary complications, of the slow, grinding costs of survival after catastrophic injury. The numbers were introduced then: yearly care estimates, therapy, equipment. The total rose into figures that dwarfed the studio's original offers. The jury did not need to be told what $75,000 would mean in that context. The numbers spoke for themselves. When Dean was called to the stand, the room grew still in a way it had not before. He did not carry himself like a star. He carried himself like a man who had already said what he needed to say in places far less formal than this. He described where he had been standing, the sound he had heard, the sight of Bobby on the ground. He described taking Bobby's hand. He described the word rose. He described the hours in the waiting room. He described the meeting with the studio. He described the numbers. 10,000, 50, 75. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He simply repeated what had been said. Universal's attorney asked him whether he had been emotional at the time. Dean met his eyes. Yes, he said. A man was dying. They asked if perhaps his reaction had colored his perception of the studio's response. Dean shook his head. Numbers don't get colored, he said. They get chosen. They asked if he was trying to use his fame to pressure the studio. Dean's answer was quiet. I'm using my voice, he said. There's a difference. When he stepped down, Rose squeezed his hand. Dean felt the smallness of it, the strength of it, and thought of how easily people like her were crushed when systems closed ranks. The studio presented its defense. They called executives, safety officers. They spoke of procedures, of audits, of the rarity of such accidents. They tried to reframe the missing bolts as an anomaly. They tried to emphasize Bobby's experience. They tried to remind the jury that risk had always been part of the profession, but something in the room resisted them now. Because anomaly did not explain 3 where there should have been 8. Experience did not explain negligence. Risk did not excuse indifference. When closing arguments came, Cohen stood and spoke not of vengeance, not of punishment, but of value. He asked the jury to consider what a life meant in a system that began negotiations at $10,000. He asked them to consider what would happen if this decision went unchallenged. How many beams would be secured with 3 bolts instead of 8? How many families would sit in waiting rooms and be told to sign away their futures because a studio wanted certainty? He asked them to return a verdict that did something more than compensate. He asked them to return a verdict that made the right choice cheaper than the wrong one. Universal's attorney closed with caution. He warned of overreach, of dangerous precedents, of an industry built on calculated risk. He urged the jury not to be swayed by emotion or celebrity. He urged them to remember the contracts. The jury was sent to deliberate. The courtroom emptied slowly as if no one wanted to disturb the air. Rose sat with her hands folded, staring at nothing. Dean watched her breathe. He watched reporters whisper. He watched lawyers cluster. He felt the peculiar stillness of waiting for something that could not be influenced anymore. 8 hours passed. When the jury returned, people stood without being told. The foreperson held a paper. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. They had. The words that followed seemed to unfold in slow motion. In favor of the plaintiff. Universal liable. Damages awarded. $3.2 million. Rose did not react at first. Then her body seemed to give way all at once. She bent forward, covering her face, sound breaking out of her before she could stop it. Dean put his arm around her shoulders. Cameras flashed. The studio lawyers sat motionless. The number hung in the room like a statement no one could take back. Universal announced an appeal within the hour. It was expected, but it no longer mattered in the way it once would have. The story was already written. A jury had listened. A jury had believed. A jury had declared that missing bolts were not a minor oversight but a devastating choice. That verdict traveled faster than any appeal ever could. Within weeks, other stories surfaced. A man burned when a fuel charge went wrong. A woman injured when a rig failed. Families who had been offered small settlements in exchange for silence began to speak to reporters. Stunt performers' unions cited the Castellano case in negotiations. They demanded independent safety inspections, mandatory equipment verification, increased insurance minimums, clearer liability standards. Studios resisted, then recalculated. Because now there was a number attached to negligence. Now there was proof that juries would not always accept the idea that contracts erased responsibility. Universal eventually settled the appeal rather than face another trial. The final figure was lower than the jury's award, but still far beyond what had once been deemed goodwill. The money ensured Bobby's care. It paid for equipment, therapy, modifications, support. It ensured Rose would not have to choose between working a department store shift and sitting beside her husband's bed. It ensured the children would grow up with stability, not survival. But the verdict did not give Bobby back his legs. It did not clear the fog from his mind. It did not restore the life that had ended the moment a beam tore free from a wall. Bobby lived another 8 years, years filled with effort, with frustration, with small victories most people never had to measure. He learned to maneuver his wheelchair. He learned to speak around his damage. He learned to watch his children grow from a chair instead of from the ground. When he died from complications related to his injuries, he was 42 years old. At his funeral, Dean stood at the podium and spoke of trust. Of the trust Bobby had placed in the people he worked for, of the betrayal of that trust, of the lie that said this was simply the cost of entertainment. He spoke of the studio's original offer, $10,000 if he died, a number that still made his hands tighten when he said it aloud. He spoke of the lawsuit not as victory but as refusal, a refusal to accept that a man could be measured so cheaply. After the service, Rose approached him. She did not speak of the trial, she spoke of something else. She told him she wanted to create something that would outlast courtrooms, a foundation to help stunt families navigate what she had endured, legal assistance, emergency support, advocacy, a place people could turn before they were pressured into disappearing. Dean listened, then he nodded. "We'll do it," he said, and he wrote the first check himself. The Bobby Castellano Foundation began quietly. No premieres, no galas, just a small office, a phone line, a promise. Over the years, it helped dozens of families. It paid legal retainers. It covered hospital gaps. It sat with widows and husbands and parents while paperwork tried to reduce their lives to clauses. It became something stunt performers spoke of with relief. A place that existed because one man had fallen and another had refused to look away. When Dean Martin died years later, Rose and her grown children sat in the church among mourners who had known him as a singer, as a comedian, as a legend. They knew him as something else. As the man who had gone to war with a studio because $75,000 was an insult. As the man who had taken a whispered name in the dirt and turned it into a promise that lasted decades. Hollywood continued. It always did. But it did so under new rules, stronger inspections, higher insurance requirements, greater union leverage. None of it made stunt work safe. But it made it harder to pretend that negligence was simply misfortune. It made it more expensive to cut corners. It made it impossible, at least in the same way, to quietly tell families to sign and be grateful. The stuntman died on Dean Martin's set. What the studio offered his widow was an insult. What Dean did about it changed an industry. And that is why, when stunt performers talk among themselves about turning points, about the moments when things shifted, they do not speak first of films or awards or famous scenes. They speak of a man named Bobby Castellano, a beam secured with 3 bolts, and a star who refused to let silence finish the job the fall had started.